Hello. Today we're going to continue on. We have talked about photosynthesis for a couple of weeks now, and we are going to go ahead and move on now to cellular respiration. So what is that? Cellular respiration is a process that releases energy by breaking down sugar and other food molecules. So specifically, that energy that's produced by cellular respiration, we call that ATP, which should not be a foreign term to you. ATP is also involved in photosynthesis, and we call that adenosine triphosphate. And the way that ATP energy is released by cellular respiration, we have to break down sugars and other food molecules, specifically glucose. Glucose is that sugar, that main sugar that gets broken down and burned in the presence of oxygen to make that energy. Okay? So we burn sugar, we break down sugar to make energy, is basically what I'm telling you. Where does it occur? It occurs in the mitochondria. If you have ever seen all those internet memes circulating saying that the only thing that you ever learn in high school science is that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, here's where we're going to learn that. Because the mitochondria is this one specific organelle, this one specific cell part that is responsible for making most of a cell's ATP, or most of a cell's energy. Hence why we call it the cell's powerhouse, quote unquote. Something that you may not have been aware of, though, is that it's not just animals that do cellular respiration. Plants and animals both do cellular respiration. So in the case of a plant, the plant absorbs the sun's energy, goes through photosynthesis and makes glucose, and then the plant cells use that glucose to make the ATP energy that they need to actually perform their own cellular tasks. So plants do both processes. Humans and other animals only do cellular respiration. So let's take a look at the equation for cellular respiration and actually the equation for photosynthesis. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write in the equation for photosynthesis, and we're going to compare the two real quick. So photosynthesis, you start with 6 carbon dioxides plus 6 waters, and you add in some sunlight, and you get glucose and 6 oxygens. Okay, so this is photosynthesis here. This one down here is cellular respiration. So if we look and we compare the two, you should notice that our reactants, what we're starting with in cellular respiration, is the exact same thing that is produced by photosynthesis, and what we're starting with in photosynthesis is the exact same thing as is produced by cellular respiration. The only difference here is our form of energy. So here we have the sun's energy that's powering this reaction, and over here ATP energy, which is a form of chemical energy, is produced at the end. So that's the difference here. But I really want you to notice that these two reactions are really truly opposites of one another. We're starting with carbon dioxide and water here, ending with it over here, and we're starting with glucose and oxygen over here and ending with it in photosynthesis. So it's very important that you realize that. So just to kind of take a deeper dive into that comparison, photosynthesis is going to produce food, or glucose, and it's going to give off oxygen. It's going to use or absorb sunlight and use CO2. Respiration is going to break apart that food and glucose. It's going to use that oxygen. It's going to release cellular ATP energy and give off CO2. So that comparison right there is just kind of a more specific way to look at it. This diagram that I am circling right now is important. I want you to know it and be able to recognize the different parts of it. So on an exam or a quiz or something, I might leave these parts blank, what I'm circling right now, and ask you to tell me what they are. So it's important that you can identify those things, okay? One more equation comparison, just a little bit neater, just so that you have that really, really, really stuck in your brain so that you know that they are true opposites of one another. If we were to draw in our arrows showing that, okay? I just want to make sure that you know that everything's kind of going in the opposite direction. So let's talk more about how cellular respiration occurs, because just like photosynthesis, there's multiple parts to cellular respiration. And the first part of it we call glycolysis. So I am going to break apart that word for you once again, because as I said, breaking down terms is going to help you. So we have two parts to this. We have our glyco part, and we have our lysis part. To lyse, or this lysis part, what this part of that means is to break down. That's what lysis is, to burst, to break down, something like that. Glyco refers to glucose. And you can kind of see that because we have that GL happening, the glyco, glucose, they sound like one another. So quite literally, when we read this term, we're reading glucose breakdown. So in glycolysis, shockingly, what happens is glucose gets broken down into two pyruvic acid molecules. And so the drawing that you see down here is when that is happening. This is a representation over here of glucose. This is what it gets broken down into. These two things over here are your pyruvates. This is going to happen in cytoplasm, or the liquid part of cells. So glycolysis happens in the liquid part of cells. You may want to write an extra note to yourself saying that, or highlighting that, or doing something so that you know where that occurs. So I would like for you as well to go ahead and write in this stuff. Glycolysis is going to require the use of 2 ATP molecules, but overall, it is going to create 4 ATPs, and 2 of our electron carrier molecules are NADH molecules. So if you recall from the photosynthesis presentation, we had NADPH, which was nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate hydrogen. So in this case, there's no P there, but it's a similar molecule. So overall, we're using 2 ATP. We are producing 4 ATP and 2 NADH. So because we're using 2 ATP, but we're overall producing 4, we have something called a net gain. And what net gain means is overall, we are producing a net gain of 2 ATP. And how I get that number is we produced 4, but we also used 2. So overall, we gained 2 because we were using 2 to begin with. So net gain is a term that I will use quite a bit. So I just wanted to make that clear what that means. So cells can harvest energy from food in a couple of different ways, or they can, to simplify, they can perform cellular respiration a couple of different ways. Our first way is known as aerobic respiration. And that means that oxygen is present during aerobic respiration. So you can kind of think of that. Aerobic sounds like air, so oxygen's in the air. So if it's respirating aerobically, you're gonna have oxygen. And so here on the right side is a little flow chart of what's happening and where that divergence happens. So we have glycolysis happening over here with our net gain of 2 ATP, because remember, we're using 2, we're gaining 4, so overall we get 2 ATP from glycolysis. And then after glycolysis happens, you could either go for aerobic respiration or anaerobic respiration, also known as fermentation. Oops, went too far. Anaerobic respiration, on the other hand, is respiration that is happening in the absence of oxygen. So oxygen is not there. And like I said before, another term for anaerobic respiration is fermentation. So over here on this little flow chart, let's say we went through our first glycolysis, producing 2 ATP, and then oxygen was there. So at that point, we're gonna respirate aerobically, and there is so much ATP that gets produced during aerobic respiration. So if we're taking this path, we're gonna produce overall with glycolysis and aerobic respiration, 36 ATP. However, if we don't do that and we go the other way, we don't get 34 more ATP. So this path, glycolysis to fermentation, produces a lot less ATP energy. So this path here going this way, this is what we want to do. This is what our cells want to do to be the most efficient. So there's a couple of different types of fermentation, though, that can happen. One of them is called alcoholic fermentation. The other is called lactic acid fermentation. So if any of you have parents that like to drink beer or study how that is produced, alcoholic fermentation is actually how that's happening. Okay? The other type, lactic acid fermentation, we actually do that in our body. So imagine that you are in PE and your coach is making you run a mile, and about halfway through, your legs start burning. That is because your muscle cells are no longer performing cellular respiration aerobically, because what you've done is you've exhausted that muscle's oxygen supply enough that there's not quite enough left to go around. So what those muscle cells are doing is they are turning to lactic acid fermentation to try to still produce energy as you're gasping for breath and trying to flood your body with oxygen. And lactic acid is what actually causes your muscles to start burning as you use them. Alcoholic fermentation, on the other hand, is going to take place in unicellular organisms like yeast. And that pyruvic acid that is produced in glycolysis, it's going to be converted into ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide. So like I said before, beer is made this way, bread is made that way actually, and so is wine. Obviously, bread is not going to be alcoholic, but if you concentrate your yeast enough and you do enough things to it, they can actually produce alcohol in big enough quantities. To expand a little bit on lactic acid fermentation, that's going to take place during strenuous exercise. If you just lift weights for 5 minutes, you're probably not going to get lactic acid fermentation in your muscles, but if you were to run a mile or sprint quite a bit, you would get that happening. Like I said before, cells are using that oxygen faster than it can be delivered to your muscle cells, and that's part of the reason you start breathing hard, because your body's saying, hey, I need more oxygen, and so it's stimulating your diaphragm to expand and breathe harder, okay? Lactic acid is going to be produced, and that builds up in your muscles as a result of that fermentation, and so that's what's going to cause your burning. Oops, clicked too far once again. So our Krebs cycle is another part of cellular respiration. So our first part was glycolysis. Our second part is referred to as the Krebs cycle, okay? So this is the part that's gonna occur in the matrix of our mitochondria. And so if you're not sure what I mean by matrix, this blue part in here, that's what I mean by matrix, okay? So during that Krebs cycle, pyruvic acid from that glycolysis is going to be used to make your carbon dioxide, make your NADH, your ATP, and something called FADH2, which again is a big, long, complicated name. Flavin, adenine, dinucleotide, hydrogen. We don't like to say that all the time, so FADH2. Electron transport is a big part of cellular respiration. And so I called FADH and NADH earlier electron carrier molecules. And that's really super accurate, because what they do is they supply electrons for an electron transport chain. And so when that electron transport chain, which is part of aerobic respiration. So make sure that you realize that the electron transport chain is part of the aerobic process. When that happens, water and those 34 ATP are going to be produced, okay? So now we are at a production of 38 ATP total. This electron transport chain, it's not going to occur in the matrix of the mitochondria, but in something called the cristae. Okay, cristae of the mitochondria. So here's your recap. Here's what you need to know about each part of this, okay? Glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm. It breaks down glucose and produces 2 pyruvic acids and 2 ATP overall. Your Krebs cycle happens in your matrix of the mitochondria, breaks down pyruvic acid, and produces carbon dioxide and 2 ATPs overall. Your electron transport chain happens in the cristae of the mitochondria. Energy molecules are going to supply electrons for the ETC. Those energy molecules, in case you were not sure, are the NADH and your FADH2. And overall, you're going to produce water and 34 ATP. Okay? So make sure that you have all of this from this table. You need all of that information. The other thing you need to know is that overall, we are producing 38 ATP as a result of aerobic cellular respiration, because only aerobic cellular respiration is going to do all 3 of these. If you are doing cellular respiration anaerobically, you're not doing this one. If it's anaerobic, you are not doing this. This electron transport chain only happens if cellular respiration is done aerobically in the presence of oxygen. So I'd like you to make sure that you know that, okay? So my hope for you is that that was a decent enough summary of cellular respiration, that you're not super confused right now. We're gonna go over this in class. So be prepared to do a lot of comparisons between photosynthesis and cellular respiration, and to talk about the nitty-gritty of what's happening in those processes. Other than that, have a good day, and I will see you in class.